Welcome and greetings to another segment of our Tour Tuesdays here at the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. One of our responsibilities here at the Cultural Center is to present an authentic, historical, and accurate narrative of who we are as people, who we are as human beings. These things we can certainly look at the historical documents that were written and recorded by the Spanish who came here, but we also rely on our oral narratives, those stories that we know and we hold true that are part of our culture. One of those things that most of us as U.S. citizens learn is about what makes this country. But one thing that is not incorporated in our education, and I can say that because it was not incorporated in my education, is how this land was developed, how it was occupied by many civilizations prior to 1500s. And in the 1500s, what brought the Spanish here was a desire to know a little bit about this place. They had many myths, they had many stories of these civilizations that were comparable to what they encountered in what we now call Mexico. They were looking for riches and gold and other components that would be sources of commodities. But also, most importantly to the Spanish at the time, they were very much still understanding the idea that they were very close to Asia. They wanted all the riches and all the commodities from what we now call China. And so they were still very much enamored with finding that place. It took another 50 years before they realized that there was a greater ocean between us and the Asian continents, but that's what brought them here. So beginning in 1530s, an effort was made to begin to explore this area. And what they found was a whole group of different civilizations that they had not encountered before, permanent, sedentary, large agrarian societies. And through that process, through that experience, they began to identify these groups as Pueblo, because that was the word they began to use. And through that time period, they were searching and looking for many things. We know that the first individual who was sanctioned and sponsored by the Spanish crown was a man by the name of Coronado. And for 2 years, between 1539 and 1542, he searched out this whole area from as far west as the Grand Canyon and as far east as Kansas. He was very much disappointed that they did not find the gold and the riches that they had found in Mexico, and so as a result, they retreated back to Spain with the reports that they had not found what they were looking for. And it took another 50 years before they realized there was a need to come back. It was still claimed by the Spanish crown. But most importantly, that leads us up to the next part of what brought the Spanish up here after the 1540s. They desired to occupy this land. One of the very important driving factors was to certainly spread the Christian faith. And as a result of that, beginning in 1598, a man who had applied for and received the support of the Spanish crown came up with families with not only just soldiers, but with entire families, as well as clergy, with the important mission of occupying the Pueblo communities. But most importantly, also to present to them the Christian faith. And it is through this desire to be representatives of a Spanish crown and Catholic monarchs, they began to certainly work to Christianize them. They contributed to a feudal system. They contributed to ways in which the Pueblo people were required to give land and food and sustenance to the colonizers. And these are the underlying factors which contributed to the unrest, mistrust, as well as to a gradual loss of the Pueblos having a sense that they were losing who they were. They were losing their community members. They were losing who they were as people. But most importantly, they were losing their spiritual constructs that had been embedded with their civilizations for centuries. This is what they were under threat. It was not solely a sense of freedom, but really a loss of existence. That was the underlying pinnings, the underlying factors, which eventually led to the Pueblo Revolt. Much has been written about the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Certainly by historians, there have been archaeological finds to try and perhaps explain why the Pueblos had to resort to violence as a way to preserve who they were. What we do know from our Pueblo narrative is that they were under a very real threat. There was a threat of loss of the entirety of their civilization. So it wasn't really just a sense or a fight for freedom. It was a fight for existence. The Pueblo Revolt also established collective cohesiveness amongst all these distinct individual groups. Because each of these distinct individual groups prior to 1680 had no specific alliance with one another. They saw themselves as individual distinct communities, clan systems, but as a result of a threat to them as a whole, they banded together to assert their right to proclaim who they were as people. And perhaps it also let the Spanish know that these groups of people were distinctly different than all those other groups because they stood up for their rights. They stood up for their rights to be seen as individuals. And in doing so, once the Spanish did return, they perhaps were not completely as authoritarian, but to a degree, some, in a sense, benevolent, as well as working collaboratively, because since 1692, when the Spanish did return, our communities have lived perhaps in a not completely frictionless society, but in a collaborative society, that many of our cultures, both Hispanic and both Pueblo, now incorporate many of these social structures. Our spiritual belief systems, our celebration of certain holidays and festivals, our matrilineal societies, sharing of land, and many other components that we help explain a little bit as it applies to the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. There is so much more to learn about the interactions of the Spanish people, their descendants, as well as our ancestors, how we continue today to look forward and work together as a collaboration, as communities. That's what the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center helps our guests understand, that these are ongoing, living societal structures that are deeply embedded in culture, in heritage, and most importantly, in language. That's what we want to help our guests know a little bit about our Pueblo communities. We invite you to join us for another segment of our Tour Tuesdays. Also, if you're interested with further information about the Pueblo culture, you are welcome to go to our website at indianpueblo.org. There's many opportunities for learning, especially through our Indigenous Wisdom curriculum. And there are other ways of donating and contributing to the efforts of the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. So until next time, our best for your health and for you and your family.